Thank you, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad to be joined right now by Danny Haiphong, who is an independent journalist and analyst who hosts a YouTube show under his own name, and he is also co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Danny, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Eleanor.
So I want to start with something that I feel like a lot of listeners might feel confused about because U.S. propaganda. But I was perusing the State Department's website, which I do in my free time, and there's a page called U.S. Relations with Taiwan. And on that page, it says, quote, "We do not support Taiwan independence, but it also recognizes them as, quote, a leading democracy." And I'm wondering how you can square that circle. And also the recent upgrade of that relationship. In late July, the Biden administration announced a $345 million weapons package for Taiwan. And it marks the first time that the U.S. has used new authority from Congress to transfer military equipment directly from Pentagon inventory to Taiwan. It's done under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which is the same mechanism Washington uses to send weapons to Ukraine. So, Danny, starting with this odd relationship that the U.S. has with Taiwan, can you tell us what exactly is going on there, and what is this recent upgrade, seemingly in aggression via the U.S.?
Sure. So the United States, and if anyone, and I'm sure some of your listeners have been following, the United States has held a long-standing contradictory relationship vis-a-vis Taiwan. On the one hand, if people were following kind of the flurry of so-called diplomatic visits by the United States, from Antony Blinken earlier in the summer to Janet Yellen to even William Burns, a CIA director who also announced that the CIA would be revamping its spy program, hoping to get better intelligence on China, ironically or unironically announcing this while in Beijing. The policy that the United States has held with Taiwan has been one of, on the one hand, acknowledging the one China principle whenever it is necessary, meaning that whenever the United States has to actually meet face-to-face with Chinese officials, but on the other hand, in terms of policy and actions, doing the exact opposite. The United States is signatory of 3 joint communiques beginning after Richard Nixon's so-called secret visit, Henry Kissinger's meeting with Zhou Enlai and other Chinese officials at the time in the early 1970s. And one of them, the 3rd joint communique, which was signed in the 1980s, actually states explicitly that the United States would eventually cease arms sales and arms deals to the island of Taiwan as part of upholding the one China principle. Of course, the United States never did that. The United States has continued to supply arms to Taiwan, and China still recognizes this as a complete and utter violation of the one China principle, seeing such arming and such militarization as a clear indication that the United States actually supports the separation of Taiwan from China, meaning that the one China principle has effectively been null and void from the US side. And so this has continued, it's only gotten worse. Each successive presidential administration, from Obama to Trump and now Joe Biden, has continued this policy, and at the same time, rhetorically has attempted to maintain some kind of neutral stance. But the fact of the matter is that each and every time these arms sales and arms deals occur, it is also coupled with equally contradictory rhetoric stating, as you said, Eleanor, that Taiwan is a leading democracy. Of course, during Trump, you had huge pushes to get Taiwan's recognition in the World Health Organization and other international bodies. There is a concerted effort to recognize Taiwan as a separate entity from China, which is in fact a declaration of war. And the militarization certainly doesn't help that, because Taiwan is internationally recognized by the United Nations as a part of China, and most of the world recognizes Taiwan as part of China, and the United States supposedly recognizes Taiwan as part of China. And this means that the United States is even more aggressively pursuing what is maybe the most dangerous policy that exists in the world today, because a war between the US and China would lead to absolutely grave consequences for humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to get into that contradictory relationship because it does seem like the US is trying to do all of things at once. And many analysts have pointed out that the US has tried to backpedal their aggressive stance towards China in some ways, like, throwing the likes of Kissinger on a plane, which I mean, I hate Kissinger, but that seems like elder abuse. Janet Yellen sending Blinken, in what North Korea's KCNA news agencies Jong Yong-hak called a begging trip to avoid a fatal blow to the U.S. economy. Jong Yong-hak said, quote, "It is the height of the double dealing with impudence peculiar to the U.S. to provoke first and then talk about the so-called responsible control over divergence of opinion," end quote. So I'm curious, what is your read on these recent diplomatic so-called trips to China? Do you think that in some ways the U.S. empire is like, oh, wait, that was really, we went too far? What's going on with that?
I think it's a combination of things, but in the final analysis, in my opinion, it is fake diplomacy because the United States all throughout this time, regardless of whether it was Janet Yellen coming and bringing a message of, well, we want economic cooperation to continue, or there was Antony Blinken saying that the United States indeed supports the one China principle. All of these diplomatic visits, and then of course you mentioned Henry Kissinger, but it's unclear with Henry Kissinger. I think that the United States probably had some hand, or at least some ear to the ground on why Kissinger was going. Perhaps was actually speaking to Kissinger about how this was an important visit to thaw ties to some degree. But at the same time, the way that that Kissinger visit transpired really did send a message that, in fact, the United States, the current administration, the current ruling order, has absolutely no grasp or control over its own diplomatic mission, meaning that the current administration actually can't get anything done because they offer nothing. And that's what has happened over the course of the last several months. I call it fake diplomacy because nothing has changed policy-wise. The United States has continued the trade war. Janet Yellen made absolutely no ground in eliminating this absolutely counterintuitive and counterproductive trade war, which mainly affects the United States. There has been no let-up of sanctions on China, on its high-tech industry, on 5G, on Huawei, or anything else. And in fact, the Biden administration has just leveled a partial investment ban on China, which is also going to hurt the United States economy. In fact, probably more than it's going to hurt China, despite all of the media hype. When I was in China, a lot of the talk about the economic slowdown globally was spoken more about as inconveniences rather than something that was going to cause devastation. But at the same time, the United States has actually suffered more from its sanctions, not just on China, but also on Russia. All of this has escalated inflation. It has also dragged the United States economy into backwardness. Much of the United States doesn't have access to a lot of this technology, and most of it is too costly when it is produced by the United States. So the diplomacy between the U.S. and China has been mainly fake from the U.S. side because it comes with what diplomacy really does involve, which is compromise, which is trying to meet parties halfway, trying to give something while also getting something. That is the definition of diplomacy. And the United States has given nothing to China, making it so that China has had to become more self-reliant. And I think this is both positive, but also it is negative in the sense that that self-reliance comes with the need to defend yourself from possible aggression. And that aggression is the dangerous part here. It is the United States continuing the military encirclement, the sanctions, all of these policies. And of course, we know that the United States has invested more than half of its military assets into militarizing this part of the world in order to contain China. So that's where the danger lies, and that's what is not changing despite all of these so-called talks. I have suspicions that these talks are more about getting them out of the way, getting out of the way this kind of global facade, trying to send a message to the world that the US is somewhat serious about diplomacy so that when the 2024 election actually heats up in the United States, the Biden administration and whoever his opponent may be can get back to the business of being so-called tough on China and ramp up these escalatory and aggressive policies toward it.
Yeah, all in the name of our so-called democratic elections. I want to talk about your trip to China in a moment, but you mentioned Huawei and the semiconductor export ban, and I want to discuss that for a minute because I feel like at the core of this, it's about U.S. hegemony and the struggle of a dying empire to try and kick other nations down the ladder as it inevitably falls down itself. And so the TikTok hearings, the semiconductor export ban, it seems like trying to keep China down economically to make sure that China remains a workhorse for the sake of U.S. imperialism, but does not rise above that. Do you feel like that's a correct analysis, first of all? And secondly, do you feel that the U.S. would actually be willing to wage a hot war in order to try and ensure that China stays below it on this ladder?
Well, the latter question may appear difficult to answer, but in fact, we have had many indications from the US national security state itself through leaked memos. For example, Mike Minahan's leaked memo, the top Air Force general. Not only was one of his memos leaked where he said aim for the head when preparing for war with China by 2025, but also he went on NBC News not so long ago, I believe it's within the last month, and he said that he does not take anything back from what he said in that memo. And in fact, the only thing he said in regret to those comments was, oh, he wasn't trying to scare anybody, but we have to be ready. And of course, NBC News, in typical war-mongering stenographer style, all the reporter had to say was, well, are we ready? And that's the mentality, right? That's the mentality that the US foreign policy establishment, and really the entirety of the US elite, save for perhaps the unspoken grumblings of certain aspects of the capitalist class, the business class have. It's really a majority opinion that war with China is becoming more and more necessary. So will a hot war occur? It's hard to say. It's hard to say when, but indeed we have major forces within the US national security state preparing for it. And in terms of the policy that the US is pursuing with China, all of it, you are correct, all of it is to try to weaken China, to arrest its development, and ensure that China remains second class to the United States. That ship has really already sailed. So it actually is an effort that is futile. China already leads. You can read the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where they mentioned that China does, out of 2/3 of all of the high-tech sector, the most advanced technologies in the world, China leads them. And that's not even to mention all the other areas that China leads, from poverty alleviation to renewable energy and environmental preservation, to technology, as stated, and of course to high class and first class infrastructure. So China is already the world leader in many different areas. Its living standards are rising. People are living longer in China. And the exact opposite is happening in the United States. And what is ironic about the policy that the United States is pursuing, and perhaps this is by design, is that as the United States becomes more and more aggressive toward China, the conditions in the United States actually become worse and worse. And I do think that there is a relationship there. It's not just that the trade war actually is taking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of business and potential investment in the United States that would benefit people, that would give people jobs, that would help people live better. But it's also the fact that the United States is investing trillions in its war machine, trillions of unspoken dollars and undocumented dollars. But of course, we know that the military budget is openly and publicly near $1 trillion, and much of that is going toward this effort to contain China. And with that bloated military budget also comes an investment climate which relies upon military contractors, Wall Street speculation. None of these things, weapons production, financial speculation, none of it lends itself to actually bettering the conditions of people in the United States. And that's why there is a deep relationship between this effort to contain China and the decline of the American empire internally. And that is going to continue. And that is really where I think the huge contradiction lies, and where people can actually start to wake up and see that this isn't working for them. But at the same time, yes, all of the policies, while they're supposed to arrest China's development, actually are having the exact opposite effect.
So, and I want to talk to you about your trip to China, because there's obviously so much, and that would alone could be a book, much less a question in an interview. But I'm curious what your trip to China was about, and what you can bring back in terms of breaking down the propagandization that happens to people who are just looking at China through the lens of U.S. empire.
Sure. So the trip was organized by the Chinese Association for International Understanding, which is an NGO in China that operates under the auspices of the International Department of the Communist Party of China. Surprise, surprise, many people may not know this, but there aren't really private NGOs or these private tour groups that are taking people around China just to frolic and, have fun and see the tourist sites. China, actually, most of its tourism is for Chinese people and is for the people there. And of course, with COVID and the economic slowdown, there's been a lot of not even intentional decoupling, but for the fact that China had a very strict COVID policy, and the fact that there are higher tensions around the world, specifically coming from the West. There is a lot less of that going on, a lot less just people traveling to China. But it doesn't really have the reputation for being a tourism center, and that's because China does focus a lot on stimulating its own domestic economy. And so when I was there, the trip was actually on the Global Civilization Initiative, which is one of 3 initiatives that Xi Jinping and the current Chinese government has put forth. There's a Global Security Initiative, there's a Global Development Initiative, and there's a Global Civilization Initiative. And these 3 initiatives cover various areas in which China is trying to put forth a vision for how its modernization and how its growth and development as a world leader in many areas can be projected in a manner that's respectful to other countries and adheres to the principles that the Communist Party of China and Chinese leadership have set forth. And with Global Civilization Initiative, it's a lot of we are working together with win-win cooperation and non-interference and ensuring that our relations with other peoples and nations are peaceful, but also taking a look at how does culture come into play? How do we ensure that the more we become integrated as a planet and as a world, that we begin to assert the fact that China is not just a country, but a civilization, 56 ethnic groups, thousands of years of history, and look at much of the global south in the same way, given that the history of the African continent, of Asia, of Latin America, of all across the world, there's these robust civilizations everywhere that China wants to learn more about, and also China wants to project a vision where people can learn from its culture. And so that was the purpose of the visit, was to focus on this Global Civilization Initiative. I was a part of one delegation, people from all around the world. There were politicians, there were former diplomats, there were academics and experts and these kinds of people. And it was a couple of days in Beijing for that conference. And then the rest of the trip I spent with a delegation going from Beijing to Lanzhou, which is in Western China, Gansu province. We also went to Danhuang, which is also in Gansu province, a westernmost province that actually borders Xinjiang province. And then we ended in Shanghai. For this trip, there was a lot of talk about the Global Civilization Initiative, looking at the cultural development, the preservation of culture, understanding how Chinese culture is integrated with the world, how China is attempting to use its modernization not as a force for hegemony and overtaking other people's culture, but how it's trying to understand people better, nations better, in order to ensure that all of these areas, development, security, etc., are integrated and don't interfere with the livelihoods of other people. And so we did a lot of meeting. We met with some officials, with some folks. We visited, for example, the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. We visited the Dunhuang Academy and spoke with them. We saw a beautiful play at the Grand Theater at Dunhuang. So we did things like that. It was a very interesting experience. I think it was very tiring because traveling around China is a huge country. But at the same time, what you learn when you go to China, when you actually speak to people, and I spoke to many party members, young party members, there is a sense of both confidence, but also there's definitely a foreboding. There is an understanding that the United States is on a reckless path. The amount of questions I got about that were very numerous. And there's a sense that China and Chinese people are prepared for this. People in China are very aware of the circumstances and situations that it faces, and that it really is our job to make people aware, not just of that, but also of the fact that we are not in that particular position, that we have a lot more work to do to ensure that this kind of conflict does not occur, and that people in the United States, people in the West are more informed, and not just more informed, but also more educated about the fact that all of the ideological, you mentioned American exceptionalism, all these ideological underpinnings and baggage that the United States and the West carries with it has to be countered and has to be rejected altogether, because it is not conducive toward reversing this absolutely reckless course that the US is on, and that it's trying to drag its so-called partners along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that rundown. So finally, wrapping up here, Danny, there's a BRICS meeting happening soon, and I wanted to hear what your thoughts are. There's a lot of talk of, these countries will be admitted. Oh, Xi Jinping is going to be there. And so that means that these big decisions are going to be made and new countries are going to go in. And what is the US going to do? And it's the end of the world as we know it. What is your feeling about this upcoming BRICS summit?
Well, if the end of the world is the continuing decline of unipolarity and US hegemony, then yes, this latest BRICS meeting will be another kind of rubber stamp on that development. It will be part of the facilitation of that process. But at the same time, a lot of what BRICS is going to discuss, from a potential new currency to adding new members to other financial security and other kind of mechanisms for closer cooperation, all of it is going to take time. So the panic really on the side of the United States, and of course the West and the Western mainstream media, is really about the fact that just the existence of BRICS itself as a cohesive and growing bloc, the fact that the BRICS countries' share of GDP surpasses that of the G7 at this moment, and in purchasing power parity terms, it's just off the charts in terms of how much it has surpassed the G7 countries, the biggest Western countries in the world. And the fact that we have gone from a multilateral institution that at one point was just BRIC before 2010, and then South Africa was admitted, and now it is BRICS. But even over that 5 to 7, 8, 9 year period, BRICS was not really as coordinated as it has become in the last 3 or so years, not just because of the world economic slowdown and shakeup, but also because of something like the conflict in Ukraine, where that proxy war led by the US and NATO and all the European vassals of the United States, that conflict has accelerated this process of de-dollarization, because countries are recognizing more and more that it's not just small countries that are due to be sanctioned into starvation. Russia right now is the most sanctioned country in the world, and yet has been able to overcome that by facilitating and catalyzing a process like de-dollarization, and using its own resources for its domestic economy. And other countries have, while maybe already doing that in some respect, have seen that this process has to be accelerated. And that's what BRICS has been doing. That's what the BRICS countries have been doing bilaterally, and now multilaterally. This summit will represent another stage of that process. So BRICS, in effect, might be, while it is perhaps the most dangerous for Western hegemony and unipolarity, because it brings together these huge countries that are operating together to facilitate this kind of process, we also have institutions like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by China, but it is a security framework that has several global South countries, with recently admitted Iran in it. And then you also have the Russia and China-led multilateral institutions like Belt and Road Initiative, the China side, the Eurasian Economic Union. These are actually bigger and perhaps even more effective in the sense that they have pursued integration economically with the global South in such a rapid manner that it only stands to reason that these countries are going to be, and arguably already are, looked at more favorably by much of the world in terms of investment and trade than the United States and the West at this point. And so BRICS coming together and working through these divisions to come up with frameworks that can accelerate economic cooperation and potentially a new currency and a whole new mechanism and several mechanisms to drop the US dollar is really a proverbial nail in the coffin, that regardless of how long it takes to get that nail into the fabric of the world economy, it's happening and it's not going to stop. There is no arresting this process. And that's why you see these desperate attempts by the United States. You had Modi visit recently this past summer, last month, late July. You have had attempts by the Western mainstream media to plant these kind of misinformation stories from anonymous officials about Brazil not wanting expanded membership, about Modi maybe not attending the BRICS summit. All of this is to try to sow discord within BRICS, and it really is desperate. It really is more a public relations campaign trying to not just minimize BRICS' significance, but delegitimize it in world public opinion, and it's just not going to work.